The Volca Keys came out over 7 years ago and has been a go-to for cheap, truly analog synthesis. But is it still relevant in 2021? And if so, where does it fit in? I'll answer that in a second, but first of all, let's get back to some synthy noodling. Before I get too deep into talking about the synth itself, I do want to say something about my own production style and what I tend to prefer in gear. I don't use external synths much. I tend to prefer self-contained groove boxes and production stations, and even my beloved Arturia Microfreak doesn't get used nearly as much as it should. So this thing has been just sitting in my closet unused for a while until it finally started kind of calling me and I decided to revisit it. So me not using this for a while is not due to any faults that this has, it's just due to how I like to work. And also note that I don't care as much as some do about truly analog versus digital synthesis. I like to make more kind of glitzy, polished, or growly, hard-hitting music, and so while I adore the sound of analog synthesis, I don't seek it out as much. So actually, this fills a really important purpose in my collection of synths. This is the only truly analog, fully analog synth that I own, and so it scratches that itch for me. People have talked before about its distinctive sound, and it absolutely does have a sound of its own. It goes out of its way to let you know that it's analog. It's got kind of this dark, smooth, yet kind of gritty tone to it. It's not necessarily going to be used for some super shiny, glitzy synthwave, but more kind of soundtrack, cyberpunk, Blade Runner inspired stuff. In my opinion, that's what I've found it the most useful for. It goes out of its way to remind you, yep, this thing is definitely analog. And if used for that effect, I think it can be really nice, with the expectation that it'll sound very warm and nice, but not all that polished. And that's really an impressive thing for something at this price point, and especially at this size. I mean, look at it. It's adorable. It's tiny. And that adds to the appeal for me. The closest thing to kind of modern EDM that I would probably use it for is some kind of like progressive house. And for being as specific as this is, it actually is surprisingly versatile. I don't want to downplay its versatility here. It's got multiple modes of synthesis that you've heard in the couple of jams that I've played so far. When we're talking oscillators and oscillator modes, I especially like the saw waves in unison, fifth, and the unison ring modes. And I think the filter sounds quite nice as well, and I use it to get some kind of wubby sounds or some plucks. But it's definitely not limited to that, and you can definitely get some interesting modulations going, some kind of chaotic sounds, as you heard that kind of alien machinery sound in the intro jam. And also, of course, you can mess with the delay time. And typically I actually use the delay much more as a reverb than as a delay, and that actually sounds pretty good. So that works out quite nicely. But of course, there are some limitations. For one thing, this is not truly polyphonic, it is paraphonic. So if you hit a note and then hit another note, it re-triggers everything. So you can play whatever notes you want at the same time, up to 3, but it is much more limiting than you might think, unless you actually lean into it and use it as kind of an effect. Typically, I like to use this a little more as a mono synth and just deal with the fact that sounds can't really bleed into each other by using the delay as a reverb, as I mentioned before, and adding some reverb in post. Typically, if I want to play chords, instead of using the paraphonic mode, I'll just use the fifths mode, and then I can just kind of use this thing for power chords. That's what I did in the intro jam. And typically, I won't actually play the key bed. For something called the keys, these keys are dinky, and that's coming from someone who loves small gear. This is kind of annoying to deal with, and typically I will sequence it using the Novation circuit or the Roland MC101, and that's much easier to deal with. I just have to clear the built-in pattern every time I turn this thing on. And yes, I basically never use the sequencer. It's something I just didn't really bother to fully learn because I can sequence it from external gear, and that's just easier to deal with because of course the circuit's sequencer is super easy and super pleasant to use, and so if I have it, I'm just gonna use that. A couple other limitations. This one is something that came as a bit of a surprise to me. Using this thing on batteries means that once the batteries start to run out, it starts to go out of tune. Once again, it's definitely analog, and so I always just have this plugged in. I like that it can run on batteries, and I like that it can be that portable. I think that's really cool, but I rarely use it because once it starts running out of tune, it gets annoying to work with. And finally, one more thing on the limitations front that actually brings this back around to the question, who is this for? There are no presets on this thing. You can't save presets on this thing. You make a patch and that's what you get, and then you tweak that patch and now that's what you get, and that's it. So for a beginner, that might be a little frustrating because maybe you make a cool sound and then can't remember how you got back to it. But because there are so few controls, you actually can learn this thing as a beginner and design some cool sounds. There's room to grow, but it's fairly simplified. And not having the ability to save presets encourages exploration. You feel like you've hit a wall with the current sound you've designed? Well, you've got to just start experimenting, start tinkering, and hopefully eventually land at something cool. And once you do, start tinkering again and hope you land at something else cool. And really explore this thing. It's not as limiting as you might think. You know, I've done a lot of sound design with like wavetables and all that kind of stuff, and so this feels a bit limiting to me, but really that's just an invitation to dig below the surface and do non-obvious things to explore everything that this little synth has to offer. And as it turns out, it's quite a bit. For me personally, this fills a void in my setup. This gets me true analog tones that go out of their way to announce that they're analog, and that is enough to scratch that itch for me. And for such a cheap price, that's absolutely worth it. And beyond that, I think this is a great beginner synth because it is small, it is compact, it is inexpensive, and it's got limited controls, so this actually can be learned even just by diving in and just experimenting, which I think is great. Now, is it worth getting this over something like the IK Multimedia stuff? I'm honestly not sure. They definitely sound different, and I think that's what most of it will come down to, although this typically goes for around half the price. So if you're trying to get into analog synthesis for as inexpensive as possible, the Volca is the go-to. But if you have a bit more wiggle room, I think what it'll really come down to is which sound you prefer and which design you prefer. But regardless of which one you end up liking better, I don't think the IK Multimedia stuff is the Volca killer, and I don't think the Volca makes that stuff just a rehash of something that Korg already did. The two can absolutely coexist, and for me personally, there is still a special place for this little synth, even if its use is rather specific and even if I don't use it nearly as much as I should. Thank you so much for watching.